Hi, welcome to Class 5. This is the last class with new content for this first module of the course. Hi, welcome to Class 5. This is the last class with new content for the first module of this course. For this class, we are introducing the field of social epistemology. Remember, social epistemology is the study of how we work together in groups to acquire knowledge. For this class, we are going to be looking at the core concept of intellectual empathy. Intellectual empathy is the key to working together in groups to create knowledge, because if we don't understand where each other are coming from, there can be no shared knowledge. I'm also including this because I've encountered the work of a critical thinking teacher named Maureen Linker. I had you read a couple of chapters for her book for today. Her ideas fit well with the direction I wanted to take the critical thinking course, and it contrasted a lot with the way traditional critical thinking courses dealt with the issue. So I'm going to start by talking about the way intellectual empathy has been talked about in traditional philosophical approaches to critical thinking, and then contrast it with what Linker does, which I take to be a part of social epistemology. In the second half of the class, I'm going to introduce an idea that Linker thinks can be helpful in creating intellectual empathy across social divides, intersectionality. This is also what I had you do your exercise on. Intersectionality is not something that is normally taught in a critical thinking course, but again, I'm doing this because I think it can help us understand what would otherwise simply appear as massive failures of critical thinking in America today. And my go-to example here is vaccine disinformation. We have a lot of problems that come from failures of information flow, and to solve these problems, we need to be looking towards the tools of social epistemology. So I'm going to start by talking about how intellectual empathy has traditionally been conceived of in philosophical approaches to critical thinking. Now, remember that in the traditional approach to critical thinking, everything is broken down into arguments that can be stated in language. So when philosophers talk about discussions, they tend to focus on situations like this. I've got two stick figures here to illustrate the philosophical idea of discussion. So the blue guy says, I want to convince you of something. Here's my argument. And he gives a premise. And the premise is going to be something that they both agree on. That's how you convince someone. You bring them in with a premise that you can both agree on. And he's got another premise that that he thinks they'll both agree on. And he says, well, if you believe those two premises, you really ought to believe this conclusion, which is a thing that I want you to believe. So he's inviting the audience to go on this motion from these premises to this conclusion. And as I have said before, this motion is inference, right? We just want to move from evidence to conclusion. And what's supposed to happen is that the other guy would say something like this. I don't think your inference works. And he'll bring in another premise that is another thing that they both agree about, right? And then he says, therefore your inference doesn't work. So this is two reasonable people having a discussion. And this is great. This is how people actually acquire true beliefs. The problem with this philosophical approach to critical thinking is it doesn't get much farther beyond this. In any conversation like this, there's going to be a lot more going on. What is going to happen if these two people don't empathize with each other? The traditional approach to critical thinking really only has one way of dealing with this, and that is to identify a fallacy, in this case, the straw man fallacy. So this is the non-empathetic version of the conversation, right? So things start out the same way. The blue guy is now talking to a purple guy. And the blue guy says, I want to convince you of something. And he gives his argument. The premise is something they both agree on. Another premise is something they both agree on. And then there's the conclusion. Well, the purple guy then turns around and says, oh, so what you're saying is P1, something only a total monster would believe. Oops, I did this in the wrong order. P2, something only a total fool would believe. And then the conclusion, something only a foolish monster would believe. And the other guy says, what? That's not what I said at all. So this is an example of what we call the straw man fallacy. The straw man fallacy is an error in reasoning that is committed when you portray someone's argument as worse than it actually is, right? And here I'll make our previous example more concrete by filling in issues, right, and premises. So imagine Monica says, I think the words under God should be taken out of the Pledge of Allegiance. It's a violation of the real principle this country was founded on, the separation of church and state. It wasn't even originally in the pledge. So here she's giving an argument. The first statement is her conclusion. The other two statements are premises. And then Steve turns around and says, you atheists want to drive all religion out of the public sphere and force decent Christians to worship in secret like we had to in Roman times. Right, again, he is misportraying the other person's opinion, and that's a fallacy. And so far, this is all great. And this is, an example I use in classes all the time. This is obviously something you see in real life all the time, especially in online contexts when conversations can get super dysfunctional. So let's go back to this example and we'll put up everything here. The problem with the philosophical approach is that the dysfunction is considered entirely cognitively. That is, it's totally in terms of, propositions, statements, assertions. The focus is on whether the assertions and whether the purple guy's assertions match the things that the blue guy originally said. And a critical thinking exercise would just focus on whether or not this representation is fair, which in this case it obviously isn't. Understanding why the purple guy is behaving the way he is considered outside the scope of the course. So part of what I'm doing here is bringing in ideas that would normally appear in psychology and interpersonal communications courses. And my long-term hope is that there's going to be more coordination between all these courses and the way they are taught. Because philosophers tend to focus only on the cognitive aspects of this exchange, when they try to think about intellectual empathy, they come up with things like this. So this is Richard Paul. He and his partner, Linda Elder, have had big careers as scholars of critical thinking. They are the authors of critical thinking textbooks, and they are promoters of critical thinking education in general. Actually, Paul recently passed away. Paul's conception of intellectual empathy is largely restricted to the cognitive domain. So he emphasizes accurately reconstructing people's arguments, reasoning from premises that you disagree with, and recognizing your own ability to be wrong. So I'll read this out loud. Intellectual empathy, having a consciousness of the need to put oneself imaginatively in the place of others in order to genuinely understand them. That's good. We must recognize our tendency to identify truth with our immediate perceptions or long-standing beliefs. This trait correlates with the ability to reconstruct accurately the viewpoints of others and to reason from premises, assumptions, and ideas other than our own. This trait requires us to remember occasions where we were wrong, despite an intense conviction that we were right. as well as consider just when we might be similarly deceived. So basically, he's emphasizing reconstructing other people's ideas accurately, plus some intellectual humility, recognizing that you've been wrong before and you'll be wrong in the future. Okay, one reason that I like Linker is that she brings out the empathy part of intellectual empathy much more richly. So this is from your reading. What is intellectual empathy? I use the term intellectual empathy for the work we are doing in this book because it captures the cognitive, affective elements of thinking about identity and social difference. Traditional models of mental processing assumed that cognitive abilities like thinking, remembering, and inferring were separated from emotional responses. Recent research on cognitive psychology has shown that cognition and emotion actually function interdependently, so that things such as attention and memory can work more effectively when accompanied by feelings. So rather than telling us to set aside our emotions or overcome our emotions, what we want to do is apply the same metacognitive tools to our emotions that we apply to our reason in order to understand ourselves and other people, and then to use this understanding to help us make good decisions about what to believe or do. So this is a tweet that I've seen going around that I saved because I knew I'd want to use it in this class. A person named Helen Rosner says, if you say that you don't allow your emotions to influence your thinking, you're actually saying you have absolutely no awareness of all the ways your emotions influence your thinking. So this is so dead right that it needed to go right in my critical thinking course. All right, so this is how I want to define intellectual empathy in this course. This is how we are going to use the term, although of course you can think whatever you want about this topic or any topic. So intellectual empathy, we're going to define it as the ability to holistically understand the perspective of the person you are reasoning with. Holistically is doing a lot of work here. It means not just their argument, but all of them. So intellectual empathy requires charitably reconstructing someone's reasons for belief, not committing the straw man fallacy, that is. Also, being able to reason from premises you don't agree with. But even more than that, it also includes understanding how their beliefs are situated in their web of belief. Remember in the class on argument, we talked about the metaphor of a web of belief. Your beliefs form a web. Some beliefs are in the center of the web, which means that they're harder to revise. So when you're talking with someone, you need to be thinking about how what they're saying is related to the things that they believe. Is this a core belief for them, or is it a superficial belief? And you also have to understand their emotional motivations for their belief, right? So essentially what I've done here is I've combined the two elements of intellectual empathy from Richard Paul, charitably reconstructing someone's reasons for their belief and being able to reason and willing to reason from premises you don't agree with, and adding some stuff from Linker, where you understand how people's beliefs are situated, there's a typo there, in their web of belief, and understanding their emotional motivations for their belief. So again, I want to emphasize that the way to deal with emotion in critical thinking is not to be less emotional or to set aside your emotions. Instead, you need to understand your emotion and apply the same metacognitive skills that you apply to your reasoning to your emotion. So the other thing I like about Linker is that she understands that self-knowledge and the ability to empathize with others are mutually reinforcing. You may have noticed that I've been sort of jumping back and forth between understanding your own emotions and understanding other people's emotions. That's because they're really similar processes. So this is what Linker has to say. Empathy, according to cognitive psychologists Gordon Gallup and Stephen Platek, is a byproduct of self-awareness. So the greater our capacity to know thyself, the greater our empathetic abilities. Empathy is not the same as actually walking in someone else's shoes or feeling another's pain, because we don't actually face the circumstances a person faces when we empathize with him or her. Instead, we have to creatively imagine what it feels like by projecting ourselves into that person's situation. This is why robust self-awareness helps us empathize more effectively. Notice, by the way, that this passage contains an argument, and that phrase, "this is why," is the argument indicator, and the final sentence is the conclusion. It is reiterating the first sentence. So this is a conclusion, first and last argument. That's a tangent. The point is that self-knowledge and understanding other people are mutually reinforcing. All right, so I want to transition to talking about intersectionality. And the reason why this isn't a total non sequitur, just as an out of nowhere, is that this is really about, again, understanding other people, and specifically understanding other people across the kinds of difference that is currently dividing our country. So, I said your beliefs form a web. This is a metaphor from W.V.O. Quine. You can think of your beliefs as little nodes in the web. They're all connected by inferences. Changing any one part of the web causes reverberations throughout the whole web. But there are beliefs in the center of the web, which would cause really big reverberations if you changed them. So these are ones that we are less likely to change. So the thing I want to add here is just that beliefs about ourselves are almost always in the core of our web of belief. Beliefs that relate to our self-conception are almost always deeply held. And this includes beliefs about the identity groups we belong to, like race and gender. Okay, so let's turn to the exercise. In the reading, Linker introduces intersectionality as the solution to something she calls diversity fatigue. And I think we can all understand what diversity fatigue is, but she uses a story of two people, Eric and Cassandra, to introduce it. Eric and Cassandra both have children entering middle school. They go to a parent orientation and find that the principal is talking about diversity, which gets a negative reaction out of both of them. So these two quotes explain their negative reaction. Eric, a white Christian working class man and parent of two children, sips his coffee and thinks, "Here we go again. Not only do I have to hear about diversity at work, but now I have to hear about it at my kids' school." Eric is tired of discussions of diversity because in his experience, they are either about how hard people have it or how good he supposedly has it. He has heard, and I'm going to drop that last sentence. Sitting in the same room is Cassandra. When she hears the principal mention diversity and inclusion, she too thinks, "Here we go again." Cassandra is a middle-class biracial woman in a committed relationship with another woman, and she is also a mother. She had her son while she was in high school and is no longer in contact with the child's father. Through the years, Cassandra has received a lot of help from her own mother, which made it possible for Cassandra to finish college and earn a nursing degree. In Cassandra's experience, when community events highlighting diversity and inclusion are being planned, she is sought after as if she was the voice of all people of color or for the gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender community, etc. So I asked you 4 questions in your exercise. The first was, what does Linker mean by diversity fatigue? Why does Eric suffer from it? Why does Cassandra? Back up your answer with quotes from the reading. I've just kind of given you a bit of an answer there. I would add that I think it's just frustration with the diversity fatigue is frustration with the discussion of diversity as it's been going on so far, driven by the fact that a lot of times it's not very productive. And it is, of course, a sensitive topic. So the other questions. Have you heard the term intersectionality before? How does Linker explain intersectionality? And how would an intersectional understanding of identity help a discussion of diversity overcome resistance from people like Eric and Cassandra? So I'm now going to answer the next 2 questions, and I'm not really going to answer the third or the fourth question in the total group. Okay. To understand intersectionality, or diversity for that matter, we have to understand the idea of what I will be calling an identity group. Other people use other names. Linker says social identity. Sometimes people just list the kinds of groups that they want to talk about. They'll say, race, gender, ability, etc. I think it's important to have some concrete meaning here because groups of this sort are different than random collections of people. This is what Linker has to say. Social identity refers to the way that people define themselves and others in terms of their membership in social groups. Just as we have unique personalities, we can be introverted, extroverted, stubborn, optimistic. We also have social identities. We can be Latino, Jewish, bisexual, Republican, a woman. In most cases, people self-identify with their social identity. But in some cases, social identity is attributed to a person or group, and this attribution can be incorrect. For example, a person who identifies as bisexual might be mistakenly identified as straight if his or her romantic partner is of the opposite sex. In addition, our own understanding of our social identity may not match up with how other people understand our social identity. For instance, a person who identifies as Latino might be surprised to find that many non-Latinos assume that being Latino means being involved with gangs and criminals. So our social identity is something we often get to define for ourselves, but it is important to remember that others ascribe identities to us as well, and these might be incorrect, unfamiliar, and painful. So one way that social identities differ from other kinds of groups of people, like if you simply yanked out all the people in America who are over 5 feet tall or left-handed or have names that end with a Y, right? One thing that makes social groups different, social identities, identity groups different than other kinds of arbitrary collections of people is that they're bound up in practices of identifying yourself and identifying other people. We all have ideas about members of these groups, and we have ideas about ourselves as members of these groups. And our notion of the group is formed out of these often conflicting practices of identifying people as part of a group and having stereotypes about that group. So here's another discussion of identity groups from a thinker I like a lot, Iris Marion Young. She was a political philosopher. She says social groups of this sort that she's talking about in this essay are not simply collections of people, for they are more fundamentally intertwined with the identities of the people described as belonging to them. They are a specific kind of collectivity with specific consequences for how people understand one another and themselves. Yet neither social theory nor philosophy has identified a clear and developed concept of the social group. She's writing along. That's changed since the time she was writing. A social group is a collection of persons differentiated from at least one other group by cultural forms, practices, or way of life. Members of the group have a specific affinity with one another because of their similar experience and ways of life, which prompts them to associate with one another more and with those not identified with the group than with those not identified in the group or in a different way. Groups are an expression of social relations. A group only exists in relation to one other kind of group, at least one other kind of group. So here we get some more aspects of it. The social groups that we typically think about are not just products of a process of identification by yourself and others. They have cultural forms associated with them, and they are phrased in opposition to other groups. So when Linker talks about intellectual empathy, she is specifically concerned with promoting empathy between people of different identity groups. And she's got a 5-point program for doing this. This constitutes the whole book that I just had you read a couple chapters from, and you'll read a couple more chapters from later on. But really for this course, we're only going to focus on one of the aspects of this for her, seeing identity as intersectional. So, what is intersectionality? Intersectionality is the way that different social identities and the power imbalances between them interact in different contexts. For instance, being a black woman is shaped by two identities, being black and being a woman. The big important thing to see here right away is that intersectionality isn't simply additive, although it often is. So what I mean by additive is that there's an urge, I think some people have, to say that, if I have more oppressed identities, I am more oppressed, right? So being a black woman is always a double whammy. And in some cases it is, often it is. But it's important to see that identities, when they interact, can interact in unexpected ways. So I just want to give you two examples. In a patriarchal society, being male has advantages over being female. But when you take the intersection of being black and male, and you take the context of interacting with the police, being male goes from an advantage to a disadvantage. I have male privilege. That doesn't always happen for people because the police are biased. I'll say that. In fact, the disadvantage of being male and black in this context can be fatal. All right, here's another example. Ordinarily, being elderly makes you vulnerable. For the longest time, the elderly were the poorest part of the American population. All of that changed with Social Security. Still, being elderly is generally something that makes you vulnerable. But if you combine being elderly with being wealthy, suddenly you're looking at the most powerful people in the world. So, major points about intersectionality. Intersectionality is not simply additive, although it often is. Intersectionality is contextual. An advantage might become a disadvantage in some contexts, and vice versa. It's not just about marginalized identities. Also, whiteness and masculinity have an intersectionality too. I want to end this discussion by highlighting a quote that Linker gives from Audre Lorde. There can be no hierarchies of oppression. Audre Lorde primarily called herself a poet, but she was also an activist and an essayist who wrote about her activism. And so this is actually from an essay, a short little essay that was published in basically a newsletter, a library newsletter, but it turned out to be important. So here's the context for it. The title of the essay is, in fact, there is no hierarchy of oppressions. This is what she says. As a black lesbian feminist socialist poet and mother of two, including one boy, and a member of an interracial couple, I find myself a part of some group in which the minority defines me as deviant, difficult, inferior, or just plain wrong. From my membership in all these groups, I have learned that oppression and the intolerance of difference comes in all shapes and sizes and colors and sexualities. That among those of us who share the goals of liberation and a workable future for our children, there can be no hierarchies of oppression. Part of the context here is that she is trying to form alliances across different marginalized identities. And I think part of it is that she's pushing back against what sometimes gets called the oppression Olympics. Oh, you think you have it bad? Well, my people were victims of the Holocaust, right? And that's just a toxic way of trying to think about things. It's really useful all the time to remember that there are no hierarchies of oppression. Intersectionality, identities intersect in unexpected ways all the time. It can be additive, but it's not always. The recognition, this is Linker again, of this dynamic aspect of social identity is the first skill involved with being an intellectually empathetic thinker, knowing that social identity is not intersectional and not simply reductive or additive. Actually, and reductive is another point in there that I haven't been emphasizing enough. No one wants to be reduced to just a collection of identity memberships, right? So this is why I defined intellectual empathy at the start as a holistic understanding of the person you're reasoning with.